So I want to share a secret. So I don't know if it's a secret, if a few people already know it, but the plenary session for this luncheon is actually a simulation. All three of us are simulations. In the IP Institute's bid to be 2001 A Space Odyssey, I'm playing the role of Dave. Sara Patak is playing the role of Hal. And Karen Silverman is like the secret AI generative engine behind all of this, who's going to tell us what we're doing right and tell us what we're doing wrong. But in all seriousness, this is one of the themes of the IP Institute this year. AI, how is it changing the face of everything? We're not going to delve in this plenary session into the issues that may come up in terms of the branches of IP law, patent law, is a creative work. Can you copyright something that ChatGPT 4 generates? We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what is it? How does it work? What are the risks? What are the opportunity? How is it going to impact law practice? Not only law practice, how is it going to impact the commercial enterprises that all of you represent, right? Businesses in various industries. And we really do have the privilege of having Karen Silverman with us. She was a partner at Latham, where she practiced antitrust law and competition generally. She is a forthcoming lecturer at Berkeley Law School on governance and AI. She represents startups. She represents Fortune 50 companies. She's the founder of the Cantellus group, which advises clients on technology governance generally, and increasingly, I would imagine, specifically AI. So please help me welcome Karen Silverman.
Thank you very much. I don't know that I agreed to be a simulation or to follow Hal, but here we are. Can't be the last time that'll happen. I think we have a couple of slides that we want to put up just to kind of run through. What I want to do today to sort of kick off the conversation is to focus for a minute on where we are, right? And we can worry about Skynet, and there's some interesting questions we can sort of get into about that. But before we get to Skynet, there's a whole lot of other things we need to worry about, and a lot of other opportunities for us to all apply ourselves to sort of determine our future, if you will. And there's a lot of energy right now in terms of Sam Altman asking Congress to regulate him, so he doesn't, I guess, have to do it all by himself. But as importantly, it's not what the government's going to do. It's not what Sam Altman's going to do. It's what we're going to do. Every one of us in this room, both in our professional setting and in our personal lives, quite frankly. So do we have the slides up? Or the first landscape. Oh, that's okay. We can talk through it, and it'll even go faster. So it's going to be a short keynote, longer conversation. But so the first point is that patent applications for artificial intelligence technologies, both foundational and at the sort of application layer, are way up, and they're way up around the world, just over the last, say 5 to 10 years for sure. You're starting to see that exponential curve. They're way up as a relative matter, as an absolute matter, but also as a relative matter geographically. And one of the things that's interesting is you see China now surpassing the United States in terms of patent applications around artificial intelligence. And that is one indication of the kind of geopolitical competition that this technology is already implicating and already starting to affect how political decisions are being made, how national security decisions are being made, how trade is evolving. And the IP space is just one area where this battle is being played out. China is by no means the only issue or concern or even impetus for competition, but it is a primary one. Europe, on the other hand, is leading in regulation, right? And they're a little bit off the back of GDPR, but not exclusively. And I know there was a great presentation just before lunch on this. Not exclusively Europe and not exclusively off the back of privacy concepts. Europe is really trying to take a comprehensive view of how regulation in this space might look. And they have taken what they're calling a risk-based approach, meaning that they've sort of tiered high-risk applications on the one hand and identified some prohibited uses all the way down to kind of the benign, run it, fire and forget kind of applications. They don't clearly yet define which applications fall in which risk tier, and it's not clear how many other countries around the world will follow this risk-based approach. It's a sensible one. The United States is taking a slightly different approach, which is a more sectoral approach and more focused, if I were to summarize, just on impact rather than risk. And those are actually quite different mindsets and starting places. One of the reasons that that the regulatory landscape is so uneven in this area right now is not just that it's new and that the technologies are young. That's true. And it's not just that we're calling for regulation for aspects of them. It's that no one can really decide what needs to be regulated, what we're aiming at, and what the purpose of the regulation is going to be, and where that purpose is best served. So some of the regulations, like the EU approach, are looking at use cases. Some of them are looking at industries. Some of them are looking at sort of opportunities. Some of them are looking at the technologies themselves, like facial recognition technology. Some of them are looking at it from a privacy perspective and data protection in particular. Some of them are looking at it from a security perspective. And so if you're looking to find AI regulation, you kind of have to look in all of those places. And it's leading to some interesting intersections. With people that are in technology, we're always talking about interoperability. It's not clear yet how the regulations are going to interoperate. The other thing that I would point out, and this plays out in some of the proposed legislation that you'll see, is that very critical in this ecosystem are people, right? There's a tendency to talk about AI as a technology, and it is a technology. We're talking about models that are really the sum product of very complex math being applied across very vast data sets of varying qualities and characteristics. But and what those models are doing, is generating predictions and probabilistic outputs at a really kind of torrid pace, right? And in classic AI, or what we all understood AI to be before last November, how those use cases got selected, how the questions and objectives for those models got set was still by humans, and it was still often in the context of a corporate purpose. So help me optimize this network, help me route my, Lyft or Uber, how to route my cars more efficiently. But the objectives for those models were set within Uber and Lyft or Airbnb or Verizon or your energy company, who were using AI to streamline and create efficiencies in their own operations for the most part. And how we encountered it was find me a car, right? Or suggest how to get my energy bills down. But it was very narrow purpose, very specific applications. What's changed with ChatGPT is not that it's still, it's still a prediction engine. It's still operating exactly the same way. And humans are still setting the objectives and still selecting the use cases. But now every one of us can do it, right? We can do it for any purpose at all. And we can do it sitting on top of an incredibly powerful prediction engine. And there's no governance on us for what kinds of questions we can ask it, how often we can ask, or what we might expect as an output. And that leads me to the next and sort of final point. Two final points I will make. So penultimate point. And that is, what models produce are outputs. They are statistical, sort of very good predictions, very good reflections of a correlation between what you've asked this model to do and the data it was trained on, right? What we do with those outputs is what I call outcomes, and those are different, right? Commercial outcomes are how we decide to use the outputs or not use the outputs, or wrap human process around the outputs, or combine that model output with some other data source, some other insight, some other learning, right? And it can be any kind of learning. And for some use cases where AI is being applied, the distance, if you will, or the geometry between outputs and outcomes can be very small, right? So if you're recommending movie engines or trying to find me that car, you can, you don't need a lot of gap or air between the output and the outcome. If you're trying to do a medical diagnosis, if you're trying to recommend somebody for a promotion within an organization, or identify how best to support a kid learning a particular kind of sort of domain mastery, you want to put a lot of distance between the output and the outcome. And that's because the output is not, we were laughing earlier, it's information that's derived from data, but it's not really knowledge, right? It is the best guess that this machine could make about which person to promote within an organization or for what reasons. And that best guess needs to be assessed, evaluated, pressure tested by the humans applying it. And that's important because the machine, and I'll call it the machine, the tool, doesn't care what the outcome. You could be asked them, you know, should I use a hammer or a screwdriver, or should I use Bob, or should I use Sue? You know, it has no independent understanding. All it's doing is evaluating all it knows, all it can scrape from our historical understanding of what a hammer is to decide whether a hammer is more appropriate than a screwdriver, right? And if I ask it to paint a picture of an apple as opposed to a picture of that same hammer, it doesn't care which it's drawing. It's just looking at its data set, trying to figure out what it has heard before about apples and reproduce those. And sometimes those reproductions are very faithful to what we expect. And sometimes those reproductions are not at all a representation of what we expect. In the case of something like an apple, it's not a big deal because we know what an apple looks like. We can validate it. Like, we all have a good working understanding of how something like that might get rendered and how it might be used and where the prediction is departing from our expectations of our purpose. Where we start using these predictions in more subjective applications and in more novel settings, we don't really know what good looks like. And that's the first work that we all have to do, is to figure out, whenever we're using these tools, even at home to sort of support our kids in their homework, is giving a thought to what good looks like, because that's the way we start to validate whether the tool is working well or not working well. It's how we start to evaluate whether we need to surround that output with a lot of human, input and buffer, or whether we can kind of deploy it as it is. So that is a hint to my actual final point, which is, although AI is advertised as bringing lots of ease and lots of efficiency, and it's going to reduce a bunch of repetitive tasks, and it's going to get us first drafts of everything that are pretty serviceable, all that's true. But what it's really going to do, and what nobody's talking enough about, is that it's going to increase the work, the human work that we have to do. It's going to increase sort of the cognitive load of being vigilant around disinformation or deep fakes, or being careful about what good looks like, or being really thoughtful about how an error in the system or a bias in the system is best remediated, right? Because it may be that the algorithm's working fine, it's doing what it's supposed to do on the data it was provided, but what that data is reflecting is that our human process is biased in some way. And we've seen that in some hiring situations, right? Where I think it was AWS sort of ended up not using one of its recommendation tools early in this process that fixed this problem since. And they didn't stop using the tool because the tool was not doing what the tool was supposed to do. They stopped using it because they realized their internal processes for promotion were problematic. And so they went back and they had to fix it kind of at the human level. Then the data gets better, then the algorithm works fine, and they can start using the tools again. So it's being somewhat, using your curiosity and some degree of humility around what these tools is producing or are producing is really important exercise for us to do. And I think that's as we get more familiar with these tools, as we start using them in practice, as our clients start bringing us questions about how these tools are running, how to protect them either within existing or novel intellectual property regime, we need to understand how they work and where these problems are coming from and what kind of cognitive energy and effort we need to bring to putting them to work for us, and not forgetting, really, that's fundamentally what we're doing, is we're getting them to work for us. And ChatGPT, just to kick off this conversation, is not really any different than classic AI, except that it's in everybody's hands. And all that governance and all that cognitive load is suddenly on us, and it's on our kids, and it's on our parents, and it's on our employees. And that's going to be a whole new management challenge for all of us, which we can talk about if we want to. But that's the real big shift, is this is now in our court. And that's both exciting and terrifying, and how we'll show up at some point, but that's down the road. First, we have this other problem we have to deal with. So leave it at that.
Thank you, Karen. So apologies about not having the slides up, but it should be in everybody's materials pack. So Karen covered the waterfront of what is generative AI, what are some of the potential impacts. So now that we've sort of covered the waterfront, we're going to spend some time on each of those beaches that make up the waterfront. But let's go back, because you said November 2022 in your reckoning was the date in which, or the approximate date on which this captured the public imagination, ChatGPT, about how AI is not the sophisticated understanding that you have, but something approaching magic. It has sentience, right? It knows everything about us. It knows everything that's happened and everything that will happen. So we're in a desperate struggle to understand and govern it, whether it's through public governance, public policy, legislation, regulation, or private governance, which is boards of directors, right? Agreements the lawyers put together. Step back. What is generative AI? Is it magic? Does it have sentience? Does it know everything? Can it know everything? Or is it just a supercomputer on steroids that has now a semi-global data set to work on and is rapidly learning as much as it can? What is it?
Definitely the latter. It's a very, very powerful tool. Full stop. Right? It is not sentient, and we can get into the philosophical questions about whether it matters, whether it's sentient, but it is a very, very powerful tool that produces statistical predictions based on everything it can find that has been written or said or depicted about a subject, right? And whether that subject is one human being or a population of human beings or this sort of population of fruits, as opposed to apples, it is just harvesting historical information that's been recorded. And that's problematic in part because a lot of the historical information that's been recorded is wrong, right? And so if you flood the zone with misinformation from the machine's perspective, that only increases the validity of a prediction that would include the error, right? It's because it's sort of the number of positive correlations between what it expects and what you're asking is how it determines validity, and that's without regard to the underlying truth. So I think sentience is an interesting question, but we're really just talking about a very powerful tool that does need to be governed. So I don't in any way want to deflate its significance. It's very significant, and we need to think in new ways, and we need to regulate in new ways, and we need to protect it ourselves and the tool in new ways. But it's not because it's sentient and going to take over the world tomorrow.
So I think that you made two very insightful points. The first is it's seeking correlations, statistical correlations. Everybody in this room studied statistics in college, maybe even in high school, right? But it's seeking statistical correlations between two records in a database, right? Oh, it's summer. Therefore, as Karen and I were talking about before, it's summer. Because it's summer, we sell more ice cream. Because it's summer, there's also more shark bites. But are those relationships, as you said, incidental, or is there a causal relationship? So it's seeking that causality by comparing records, correct?
Yeah, and that's sort of that distance between the output. I mean, the model output might say shark bites and ice cream sales are going up at the same time, and it's up to sort of humans to have some understanding or some other set of inputs that says, is that a meaningful relationship between those two things, or is that, and in some contexts it might be like what happens if the question was what happens in the summer, that's a meaningful output. If the question is how do I increase ice cream sales, it's not, right? So that's what I mean by sort of the human vigilance and insertion into the process, and this risk that we over rely on the outputs we're getting because it looks like math is problematic. And just we were talking earlier, humans' basic understanding of how to ingest and understand and appreciate probabilities is terrible, just terrible. Like, and usually any political polling company will tell you that they kind of they rely on the fact that we don't really understand how to read statistics very well, or govern or how to have a emotion around the statistics. And that problem now just got magnified into every sort of corner of life. And so we've got to be much more vigilant about how we're looking at these probabilities.
I'd like to ask a question I think most of us in the audience are asking ourselves, and I think you're alluding to this, Karen, but can generative AI perform legal reasoning, or are we just going to be surpassed?
I mean, I think that the harder truth here is that a lot of legal reasoning isn't that kind of novel or complex. I mean, there's a lot that we do that really isn't, that yes, will lend itself to some of these tools to support the work, right? I mean, when we're looking, finding all the cases that X, that is something the tools are already getting very, very good at. Help me write something that is help me figure out what is a fabulous novel argument or an acceptable mainstream argument about a novel set of facts. That is still where we apply our judgment and need to apply our judgment. So there's a place for these tools in legal reasoning, but I think we need to have a little humility about where we're really adding that special something and where we're not. So
I think one of the goals, picking up on Sarah's point, of every lawyer is just to practice law, right? You don't want to fill out timesheets. You don't necessarily want to answer or listen to your voicemail or look at email. You want the research on your desk, you want it distilled, and you want to apply what ChatGPT 4 and no successive generative AI engine can do, which is apply your experience and your judgment to that. So theoretically, then it could actually help, right? Generate that research. There may be some training issues with young associates, but it could help.
I mean, it raises a lot of questions about the business of law, but just that, focusing for a minute on the practice of law, I think there is a lot of utility. These tools are really good. I mean, they're good in lots of settings, but they're good in some very specific settings. One is where we're looking for something that we know what it looks like the apple. Like I want a picture of a red apple that I can use for a thing. The other setting that they're really good in is where we're trying to find new connections and new ideas and brainstorming and help me improve this argument, or what am I missing in this kind of, I've written down my 10 points. Are there points that I'm missing and why? How we individually govern ourselves using the tool in those two different settings will be very different. One is you're just check it's an apple or it's not an apple, it's suitable for the purpose. And the other is okay, you've given me something to think about, but I can't start my thinking or stop my thinking with just what it's provided. And I think one of the risks with the brief writing and the memo writing is that we all have this tendency, this is just a human kind of cognitive bias, is that when we see a draft, and we see this with our associates, when we get a draft of something, it in some way stunts or stifles our creativity, because now we're starting to look to sort of how do we perfect this draft as opposed to how do I perfect the argument, right? And so we've got to be especially on guard for those sorts of risks when we're looking at model outputs, as we would if we got a brief from a second year associate that was pretty good and sounded right, but might have missed a chapter, right? So it's that kind of thinking that I think lawyers are very well suited to, because that is something we do day in and day out, is inspect, interrogate, and question. We just got to get really good at it, and we've got to make space for it in ways that I think in a lot of process we've kind of engineered or administrated the time that we spend asking questions out of the process. We got to pull that all back in.
I think one of the fears that knowledge workers, and everybody in this audience is a knowledge worker, right? They're dealing with symbols, language, and trying to find relationships between languages or these symbols and combinations that will be persuasive, right? Counterparty in a transaction, a license or whatever it may be, or in a litigation to convince judge and jury. So I think the fear has been that perhaps generative AI would be to knowledge workers what manufacturing technology was to the United Auto Workers, perhaps, or to manufacturing employees. But what you're saying is, it's just going to require a different skill set, probably a narrower and, with all respect, higher skill set than just reading through cases and shepherdizing them and assembling them in some sort of memo for somebody to generate a brief.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that we're trying to spend our time regularizing process, we're sort of putting ourselves out of jobs, which is okay. But the bigger challenge to the practice of law is that what clients will pay for and how they will define expertise may well change, right? So right now, clients are paying us to get smart and to do that work and to apply our judgment as the sort of sum total of a whole, litigation strategy and execution or implementation or a deal. And it's not at all clear to me. And every professional services and basically most professions are dealing with this, is how are we going to value and price and market that special thing that we're adding that is right. And so it's not just that revenue curves are going to change, but cost curves are going to change. And nobody knows kind of in what direction exactly, but everybody expects it to be a fairly steep adjustment. And so from a business perspective, sort of figuring out, are we finally coming to that point where alternative fee arrangements, become acceptable in the norm? Maybe it is, because billing by the hour may not make sense in a world where you can so quickly abbreviate the basic work and research.
Right.
So from an industry perspective, I'm just sort of switching gears. What are some of the examples of ways that your clients are using generative AI within their organizations? And are you expecting to see that kind of change in industry as well?
I am. It's interesting. So one of the things that we do is we're the subject matter experts for the Business Roundtable and their Responsible AI initiative, which is a really interesting initiative because it's the CEOs of the sort of top public companies in the United States or corresponding organizations around the world, but we focus on the US. And so we get kind of a landscape view of how these tools are getting integrated and what's on their mind. Right now, it's a lot more experimentation. I think everybody's worried about, do I need a policy for what my employees can do and not do? And yes, you do need a policy. Probably you should build it on the one that you have, as opposed to start all over. But the use, I would say that the uses in marketing, the authorized uses, to be clear, tend to be in marketing. They tend to be in that brainstormy category as opposed to the repeatable process category right now. There are a few areas where, one of the reasons for that is that where AI is valuable for things like network optimization and repeatable process, they're already using narrow AI tools and they don't really need generative AI tools to do that. In this more creative exploratory category, generative AI is particularly strong and good. You just need guardrails and guidelines around how to do it, what information to submit to the tools, how proprietary the tools need to be, that sort of thing. So it tends to be in the more creative areas. So it's first draft generation, and usually in marketing and advertising right now. Some are playing around with things like summarizing policies to try to determine where organizations are in or out of corporate policy, or where their policies are conflicting, because that's a big problem internally in a lot of large organizations. So that's on the big public company front. On the small, startup kind of front, they're using it for everything and with really widely varying results. Yeah.
And how are you incentivizing them to create some type of internal governance or policies? Are they coming to you, or how's that working?
Some of them, there are, it's the usual motivators, like terror is a good one. But and I try not to terrorize people because I don't think that's right. I don't know that I don't think that's very productive ultimately. But I think the focus of the government increasingly on understanding that we're not going to let Europe regulate this for everybody in the United States. It's like we're not going to. We had a vacuum to fill. We're filling it, and this administration's been very thoughtful about how it's trying to do that. So I think most people are understanding that regulation is a thing that's going to happen, and so there's a curiosity about that. You're starting to see law enforcement in this area, and that's where the terror and fear come in, which is, oh, we could be accountable for this in some ways that we don't fully appreciate. That's an issue. I think the one that's really motivating people now, it's two. One is brand reputation and kind of vulnerability around, everybody's heard the Samsung story where the engineers put a bunch of proprietary code up on it was ChatGPT, and sort of the risks associated with not just privacy, but trade secrets, and brand reputation, where Snap had an issue last night with one of its bots going off in a weird direction and giving really inappropriate advice on eating disorders, so they had to pull it down, right? And at some point, organizations that are pulling these tools down regularly are reflecting to the market that they're not really doing the kind of testing and thoughtfulness they need to do just on the product design, and that has reputational blowback. So that's an issue. I think insurance is becoming an issue because underwriters are starting to price this risk. So you've got all these sort of market forces in play that cause people to pick up the phone and call us and ask, or it's that they're working with their kids on trying to, do soccer schedules, and they realize how powerful the tools are suddenly, and their minds sort of wander to where else this is going to matter. And we get those phone calls as well.
Karen, you advise the Business Roundtable. You also advise startups on governance, private governance generally, as well as public institutions domestically and internationally. But frequently, government response to very rapidly developing technology is slow, very slow, to the point like even now in the United States, we're still struggling with governance of privacy issues,
Right.
Trailing the European Union. But frequently when that public governance develops, it follows patterns established by private governance. So what are some of the best practices that you advise your clients, that everybody in this room advising clients might take back to their clients?
Sure. So one is knowing what technologies you're using and why you're using them, and starting to sort of map out where uses are and the associated purposes. This will translate when the regulations start to come. There's undoubtedly going to be an accountability kind of assessment feature to them, where whether that's an annual audit or some kind of a self-assessment or some kind of a third party, conformity assessment against an external standard, unclear, and it'll probably vary by industry. And so we have to do very close work to figure out what that looks like. But the knowing and the mapping and the documenting is something that everybody can start doing now. Starting to develop management processes for your people, because not everybody, it's like I liken it kind of ironically to driving, which we're all going to stop doing, but not everybody needs to know how to build a car or even fix a car, but we all got to know how to drive a car, right? And there are going to be people in your organization who all they need to know is what are the rules and how do I follow them and when do I flag something for somebody else. So it's the issue spotting that we do in all sorts of areas of compliance today. We're going to need a mechanism for training up vast numbers of people to be engaged enough to be able to issue spot to do the compliance we're going to be asking them to do. We can start thinking about what works in our organizations and what doesn't. Very popular right now are the institution of data and AI review boards, because most organizations, corporations, and well, actually public or private institutions, and one of our biggest projects on this is a public international organization, is they're not built to integrate AI policy questions, data protection questions, and security questions, for instance. Those all come up in independent silos, and the HR department doesn't necessarily have access to the integrated thinking of a digital review board. And so the layer, that sort of coherence layer that's getting installed in a lot of places, is an effort to bring a cross-functional team together with some scope of authority and resource to think more broadly about sort of the digital environment and how that connects up to risk, strategy, and compliance. And so what you can start to do now is sort of look at your own organization and think about how well are we coordinating these functions, because they can run either in alignment or they can run in tension to one another. They definitely compete for budget, and they definitely compete for executive time and board time. And that's got to be fixed, because that's going to be very counterproductive if that's just left to its own devices. So structurally, I would focus on that. For future proofing, I would start thinking now about how to manage human beings through this period of time. There's some other challenges that are coming up for that, but really look at the human piece of this and workforce readiness piece of it. And then from a technology perspective, like I said, really understand what you're using it, why, and be ready to document that in ways that are appropriate for your organization. And that will differ by industry, organization, and geography, frankly. So those are 3 things you could do.
So a few key opinion leaders and some politicians here and in the EU have called for a sort of a moratorium on generative AI until we can sort of get a handle on exactly what it is and how to use it. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a good idea or not?
You know, I understand where that impulse comes from, because it's like, wait, you know, and when we were talking about November 2022, it's like, that's when those of us who are in this area knew OpenAI was coming out with ChatGPT. I think it was December 4th that it was actually released, or close to that, but it's a day that we all kind of remember. And I think you know, again, the issue, I don't think it's realistic to do a pause on like what's already out there. Not very many people are suggesting that. I think it's reasonable to think about putting constraints on the base models themselves, and that's something we can actually do fairly readily. I don't know that a pause or a moratorium is the right way to do it, but if we started looking at meaningful, well, understanding and constraints on the distribution and proliferation of the base foundational models, that's important. I think this is maybe not the most, I mean, as lawyers, we should be thinking about it lots of ways, but I think we need to immediately start thinking about enforcement of the rules that we do have. So if someone's, you know, perpetrating a fraud using ChatGPT, which is happening, we have rules to deal with that. And we need to be very aggressive and muscular about, I think, setting norms through some law enforcement activity. And it's the FTC is doing what it can do. That's a whole other conversation. But I do think DOJ, all of these components, DOJ, you can build into procurement standards, sort of base quality and performance metrics, and you can start educating people that they've got to think that, you know, that I've got a big problem with the language we use around this. We call everybody a user or a consumer, like, you know, and we treat it like it's this device. It's not, it's a way too passive concept, right? We don't really have good language for what it is, but it's an active, you're in the regulation, everybody talks about deployers. Nobody wants to call themselves a deployer, right? So that's not going to work. Collaborator has weird connotations. So we're still searching for the language, but it's something much more forward leaning and active than user or consumer. And we need to get that through everybody's head.
Karen, we have about 15 or less than 15 minutes left. I think we want questions from the audience in a few minutes, but I think that Sara and I would be greatly remiss if we don't talk about ethics, right? There are a couple of ways of talking about it. We can talk about the rules of professional responsibility ultimately issued and promulgated by the state Supreme Court. That's interesting, but that'll be addressed actually in our plenary session at the end of day 2 tomorrow with Mike Drum and Tom Spahn, Tom from McGuire Woods, a national ethics expert. I'd rather talk about ethics in the larger normative sense, right? Governance exists for a reason, commercially to conduce economically gainful activity, right? But in a polity, a political society, governance exists to, you know, promote values, right? Like non-discrimination or equality or competition or whatever it may be. And it's important for you to make the point to us that ChatGPT and generative AI is just a statistical engine. It shows correlations. It's not showing us like what's beautiful, true, and good, you know, the great philosophical values. It's just saying, this is how you live, and this is the things that generally go together. We still have a role as not consumers, users, or deployers, but as citizens, right? To establish the ends to which we direct these engines. Is that fair?
I think that's really fair. And that goes back to that objective setting, which we now all control, right? And sort of what are legitimate, you know, what is the community at large going to decide is a legitimate set of objectives and what is not? What would we expect in an academic setting or not? What would we expect as a matter of business ethics or not? In a legal context, you know, how much research and, you know, sentiment analysis do we do of counterparties in transactions or adverse witnesses? You know, the profession's going to have to develop rules around that at that level. I think there's been a lot of focus on ChatGPT and kids like cheating on exams. I mean, that's plagiarism is an issue and cheating is an issue. I think the bigger question is how are we going to redesign education to bring our kids up to speed on how to think critically about what they're seeing and reading. And there are challenges, and that's going to be really hard work. So I think the ethics has to, the ethics of making time and space and respecting questions and like I would say, ask good questions and question good answers. We've got to, whether it's in your boardroom that has a preset agenda from 12 months ago, with standing items that aren't going to change and doesn't really leave room for directors to get smarter, or whether it's a teacher who's saying, I just need you to know the following 7 facts in the right order. Is that really how we want to run our systems, in light of a tool that can intermediate so much of that, right? So I think that, so our ethics questions are going to get very practical. They're going to be applied ethics very quickly. And so it's interesting and fun to think about what's right, true, and good. And we have to do that. At the same time, we're understanding that we're applying those assumptions kind of immediately and in these very complicated settings.
So ChatGPT isn't going to relieve us of the burden of free will and choice. We still have to make those decisions.
Well, maybe that's my underlying message, is that it won't if we lean in. If we don't lean in and we just kind of let it make its best guess, that's what we're going to get. But so that, fundamentally, that's the call to action, is not to let that happen.
But we'd love to hear from everybody out there. There have to be questions. If you just raise your hand, maybe Evan or somebody in the back can bring a microphone to you. And if they can't, Sarah and I will repeat the question for the recording. Dan Sweetser is going to be our volunteer. Questions from the audience, please. No questions? I have a hard time believing this.
I'll say one thing that hasn't come up yet, that I'll just, while you guys are thinking about your questions, is disinformation and deep fakes. Like, this is going to be a really big management problem for everybody in this room. Well before the technology, we figure out how to watermark and identify the sort of synthetic content, how we talk about it, how we identify it, how we, again, support everybody through this kind of period of uncertainty when what you're seeing and reading and hearing can't immediately be trusted, is going to be a really big challenge. And I mean, I would put it out to the group just to start thinking about that. But question?
How do you talk to your clients about AI hallucinations and ChatGPT lying?
Yeah. Well, I think we try to get down to the root cause, right? Which is that it doesn't care if it's lying or not lying. It's just, again, drawing correlations, right? So why would the hallucination be happening? Is it because the data is incomplete or wrong? Is it because the math or the logic or the algorithm we're putting on top of that is not making very good correlations, like that hasn't been designed well? Or is it because a human didn't ask a very careful question? Or is it because, and this is actually something we're talking about, is most of ChatGPT was trained on kind of Western, I mean, I would say, frankly, coastal liberal democratic data sets. Like, the global South is missing. So if it's hallucinating about something, a business strategy or some expectation, not having to do with what that data set skews to, that could be the source of a problem. So we talk about the source of the problem. We talk about the need to consider the possibility when you get your model outputs. And I recommend that clients, whenever they do, and this, again, true if you're trying to find good recipes for chili, and true if you're trying to figure out your marketing strategy, ask the same question multiple times, like no fewer than 5. And you'll see the range of different outputs you get and outcomes, right? You're not going to get the same answer twice. And then ask the question like 5 different ways and see the range of outcomes you get. And that'll start to give you a sense for how good the tool is at asking the kinds of questions you're really interested in. And it'll give you a sense, it'll improve your thinking about what you're really asking about and why, right? So having, again, that, what tool are we using? What problem are we trying to solve? What does good look like? All of that is work that we do while we're using the tool. It's not that we have to do it all on the front end, but we do it while, so these hallucinations are instructive, maybe is what I would say.
Questions?
In the back.
Thank you. Thank you for that very informative talk. Do you see in your analysis or your scheme any kind of liability or culpability for the maker of the tool, since this is such a powerful tool and since the output is so complex given to the setup? Do you envision any culpability there for the makers of the tool or the folks who configure it?
I mean, yes, ultimately, depending on the use case and the application. I think in Europe, there's an effort to actually shift the presumptions around liability, and that has not played itself out yet. But so they're expressly trying to do that. And then I think we're going to learn a lot more about what this tech stack looks like. There's going to be, will there be liability at the foundation model level? Probably some, but that'll look different than at the application level. And then you're going to have it at the user, deployer, collaborator level, right? And there'll be theories of shared liability and contributory liability also. I think where we're going to see, and it will, different compliance regimes in different domains, like the SEC is going to have a very different approach to this than the FAA, for instance, very different kind of approaches. But and the FDA is doing some interesting work on this as well, because of what it's shining a light on is how little we really know about the efficacy of a lot of the pharma projects or products that we use, right? And the uncertainty that we're starting to see in ChatGPT and some of these other AI applications has been embedded in, for instance, food and drug for years, right? So it's a really interesting analysis that they're doing. But where we're going to also start seeing this show up is in the insurance and sort of the priced risk industry, right? Where there are either going to be insurance pools that you can buy into for some of these use cases, or the ability to self-insure is going to be limited in some ways. So, I mean, you're going to start seeing the secondary risk markets issue around liability, ultimate liability.
Any other questions? Do you have one in the back?
Can AI unlearn something?
It's a
Like-
really good
Like,
question.
I'm thinking like a takedown request, like, uh-oh, my trade secrets are there. I needed to unlearn those trade secrets.
Not in that instance, no. It can't, once it's out, but what it can learn, and this is, and there are businesses already starting about this, is how, it's sort of like those reputation management businesses, that go out online and they basically try to change the math and the dilute the errors. So there's the dilution strategy to unlearning things. There's the coding of data, which is what a lot of content moderation sort of schemes are built on right now, which is how do we label this data as invalid for the model? So that's one approach. But we need as of today, we need an articulate approach to either diluting or tagging information that we want unlearned. One thing that could be possible, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, so you'll listen more closely, is but if you put into the system, so say on Facebook, I don't like the direction, like I'm going down one of those wormholes, right? Can you reset it to like factory settings? Can you go back to neutral? Like, I don't like where that algorithm's taking me on chili recipes. I want to start over with, meatless. Can they put back in our hands the ability to reset our experience to something more neutral? And I think that's an interesting area where people are working. And then they're working, interestingly, what they terribly named, there's so many bad words in this, like zero trust is not what it sounds like. But PETs, which are these privacy enhancing technologies, is really a whole suite of technologies built around how to control and govern data flows. right? And it arose because of the privacy rules out of Europe, but really organizations are figuring out that they need to control all kinds of information, whether that's sanctions compliance or trade secrets or whatever it is. So you've got ways to kind of compartmentalize some of that knowledge and learning, but not really erase it. The other hallucination that's kind of hilarious is that ChatGPT has no sense of time. So it's not good at telling stories. It can tell stories up to about 5 steps, and then it loses track of how events are related in time. Right?
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's like it's got these weird limitations that are starting to, and also weird capabilities. I'm not gonna lie. Like it's when you put somebody, if we don't know a person who speaks all the languages, knows medicine, art history, military history, knows all of that. So when you put all that information together, you just get some really interesting, and what they're calling like emergent capabilities. It's not sentience. It's just the ability to correlate across and kind of incredible wealth of historical information.
Karen, thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us.
You're welcome.